Hello. Autumn. I think autumn is one of the best months or seasons to read. I think it's transitional. You can read some summery romances, you can read the classics, you can read thrillers. I just think whatever it is you want to read, you can do it. So I'm going to be talking about some of the books that I read this autumn. Some I liked, some I didn't like, but I'm going to be talking about them all anyway. So the first book I have is Tender is the Flesh. This is a dystopian horror / speculative fiction. It's set in a world where a virus has wiped out animals. So animal meat is no longer consumable by humans, and because of the lack of animal meat available for consumption, humans are bred and harvested for consumption by other humans. And this book really explores the protagonist, who is named Marcos, and he actually is in the human harvesting business, and we see him go through his day-to-day life. Sometimes he questions it, other times he gets on with it, and we actually see him form a relationship or a bond of sort with one of the humans who is being bred for this purpose. Themes, we've got cannibalism, morality, to a large extent I think power as well. I personally absolutely love this book. I think from the writing to the plot to the ideas to the imagery, it was stunning. I think it's not that easy to executing is something different. And sometimes execution can be difficult, but the writer executed the ideas so well. I wouldn't be surprised if we see this on our screens one day. I think it's the perfect kind of book that can be adapted into a movie. What's crazy is that things are described in intricate detail, so it is very kind of, the imagery is right there, and it's gory to some extent depending on how much gore you've read. But I think it gets you to think about kind of how we treat animals. Essentially, they go through the exact same thing. And I've never seriously considered being a vegetarian or a vegan, but reading this, you know, it had me thinking. The ending really got me. But yeah, won't go into it, but the ending really got me. Diary of an Oxygen Thief by Anonymous. I don't know if this is an autobiography. I think to a large extent, it's assumed that it is, and I personally, myself, I think that it is. I said it's anonymous, and you'll understand why when you read it. See the narrator kind of recount himself, his behaviors, especially within relationships, how destructive of a person he is, especially when it comes to women. He's a male manipulator, essentially. I wouldn't go so far as to make the comparison between him and the Underground Man from Notes from Underground, but people do point out similarities. It does kind of have a confessional tone, and I think sometimes you may fall into the trap of feeling sorry for him, especially towards the end. Don't fall into that trap. But yeah, essentially it is very much about a very bad man and how he treats people. It does feel a bit edgy, which isn't surprising because I do remember seeing this book on Tumblr years ago when I was very young. So I'm not very surprised about that. Going into this, you have to remember it's not a literary work of art or anything like that, a diary, so to speak. So if you're looking for kind of eloquent prose, you're not going to find it. You're going to find someone who is horrible, and you will hate him, but I think that just makes it all the more interesting to read. I know this book has its fair share of haters. I can't say that I hate it. I'm not saying I absolutely love it, but I think it was an interesting read. I like anything that kind of gets me thinking. Yeah, I don't really have much to say about it. Don't love it, don't hate it. You know, it was okay. Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love, which I read on my Kindle. So this is a collection of short stories which explore various themes, a lot of regret, kind of emotional bonds, especially with your parents, and kind of, yeah, the complex relationships that come, especially within immigrants' households. I think cultural identity is huge for this, which is one of the reasons I read it. Motherhood as well is a very prominent theme. Not every single story is about motherhood, but it does come up quite a few times. I personally really like this. It was very poetic eloquent, really emotional. I think you will really like this, especially if you come from that kind of background. I haven't really looked into the author. From the stories, I'm assuming she is South Asian. And I think if you do come from that area or around that area, whether that's the Middle East or Mediterranean, I think there's a lot that you can compare within yourself and your family and kind of your connections with your family. I just loved her writing style. I often can find myself be a bit bored by short stories. When the topic is interesting and when the writing is really good, that's when I love it, and this is one of those instances. I just thought it was great. Book Lovers by Emily Henry. So this was the first Emily Henry book I read. It's about a literary agent, Nora. She basically goes on a vacation with her sister for reasons that she doesn't really know and tries to figure out the entire time. But all she knows is her sister wants her there. So she goes. They vacation in this really small town, really small, quirky, dainty town. When she's there, she encounters her professional rival, Charlie. Really interesting. In the beginning of the book, they clashed and they repeatedly run into each other whilst in this small town. Obviously, she doesn't know why he's there. She soon does find out why. It's really nice to kind of see their interactions and how it changes over time. The writing style is very witty. There's a lot of humor in there, which I really appreciate. Found it really funny, actually. There were some really funny moments in there. And I don't know what the overall consensus is on Emily Henry and her books, but judging from this one, I really like her writing style, and I'm really open to reading her other books, and I want to read her other books as well. I think it wasn't just the main characters, the secondary characters, and kind of describing the town and the atmosphere. I think it was all just really well done. The first half of the book, I was a bit hesitant. I wasn't sure if I was gonna like it, but it picked up, and after that it was absolutely great. I loved it. So yeah, I really did enjoy Book Lovers. It's a really great experience reading that. The ending, I went through 1,000 emotions, especially with the last like 3 chapters. But all in all, I really loved reading this. Pumpkin Spice Cafe, which I also read on my Kindle. I might upset a few people with what I have to say about this book. But let me explain it before I get into it. So this is a cozy autumnal romance set in a small town. Also, it's kind of the romance plot. More so than anything, autumnal have a cozy vibe, kind of a nostalgic feel. A lot of people compare it to Gilmore Girls, which I can see why they do. The writing style, I don't think there's a distinct writing style there. I'd say it's just kind of cozy, light-hearted and warm. In terms of my thoughts, I think it was okay. It's a book that you see everywhere and it's hyped and everyone talks about it and raves about it. I personally wasn't that into it, and I didn't really enjoy it as much as I thought I would. I think if you're looking for a cozy vibe, you'll get it. If you're looking for a small town romance, you'll get it. But I think beyond that, you know, if we're talking about really great writing or good characterization or character development, it was just none of that. And I personally think it doesn't really matter what you write about. It's really important that your writing is good and that your characterization is good and that there's depth to your characters. I just feel like there wasn't any of that in this. And because of how one-dimensional the characters were, I really couldn't get into it. And I couldn't get into the romance, and even the small town vibe, I couldn't get into. But again, as I said, I understand why people like it, especially during autumn. It is warm and light-hearted, and I think it is a palette cleanser if you're between genres. But I mean, if we're talking about me and my taste, I was a bit underwhelmed, and I think it just wasn't for me. Powerless by Lauren Roberts, a book that I've finally picked up. This is a fantasy. It's set in a world where there are elites and they have powers. There's mundanes who also have powers but just not as impressive as the elites. And then there are the ordinaries who have no powers whatsoever. The book follows Payden. I think that's how you say her name, but I'm not too sure. I'm just gonna say Payden. Payden actually has no powers, but she poses as a psychic, and she has a run-in with the prince of the kingdom. And and consequently she finds herself in the purging trials, which is the elite's way of kind of showing off their people's powers, and one person ends up winning, and so on and so forth. You get the gist. So I actually used to be really into fantasies, but I feel like there was a point where I just read them so much that I was exhausted with fantasies. So I actually haven't read a fantasy since then, and it's been a very long time. So I decided to pick up this, which is more of a romantasy, I'd say, more so romance than fantasy. So if you want something that's more fantasy and world building, you probably won't find it in this, and you'll probably be a bit underwhelmed with this. I did really enjoy it. I know not a lot of people do, but I really liked it. I really liked Kai, the main character. It was written really well. I really liked their interactions, actually, Payden and Kai's interactions. Is it like the perfect fantasy? Probably not. But as far as romantasies go, I think this is good, and especially it's good if you're a beginner with fantasies. So yeah, it was hype. I actually really liked it, and I will be reading the second book as well. So yeah, this book is probably a bit of a shocker because I have mentioned on here multiple times that I am not into dark romance. I read The Predator by Runix. So I read this as part of kind of like a book reading challenge, and I wasn't going to do it, but I thought, why not? Looking back, I wish I didn't read it. This is a dark romance. The main female character, she is in the mafia world. Her father's a mafia boss, and she crosses paths with the main male character, who is named Tristan. He is also within the mafia, and he is also very high up, and their families are enemies basically, and he also hates her for his own reasons, and the book basically delves into that. It is her perspective, and it's just kind of a lot of like uncovering secrets with their families and kind of enemies to lovers. Themes, I guess, kind of betrayal, revenge. So yeah, as I've said, I don't like dark romance. This has probably solidified where I'm standing with that. If I'm gonna be honest, I found it very boring, which is really weird because I read some reviews and they were like, it was so interesting and fast-paced, and I couldn't put it down. But I was like, I was struggling to pick it up. For what it's worth, I think the plot had a lot of potential, and I think the main characters and kind of their relationship and their dynamic also had potential. But it was the writing, in my opinion, that completely let it down. The dialogue was lacking, and when I say lacking, I mean it was physically lacking. Like, there was hardly any dialogue. The writing, I would say 80% was the female characters' internal thoughts. You'd find a lot of the time it was the same thing again and again, so it was just redundant. It was repetitive and redundant, and I was really tired of it. I think when I come across writing that's just not how I like, or kind of to my taste, I stop caring and I stop wanting to read. Even I will continue to read, but I would have like mentally checked out at that point, which is basically how I was with this. I had mentally checked out. I couldn't care less about the characters or the plot. So quite honestly, I can't actually tell you what happens towards the end. I mean, I can, but in a very surface level way. So yeah, safe to say I wasn't a fan of this book. There is no devil. This was the second book in the Sinner's Duet by Sophie Lark. I read the first one last year. This is a dark romance, and surprisingly, the first book I actually really enjoyed. This one, not so much. So the plot of kind of, the duet, the first book, is basically a psychopath or a serial killer falling in love with an art student. This book follows on from that, just delves into the relationship between the two and explores that in relation to another serial killer as well, who we knew of in the first book as well. Themes, obsession. So I didn't actually finish this book. I'm not someone to DNF a book that easily. It has to really not get me for me to not finish it. And this was one instance of that. I think I DNF'd at around 60%, which is around the case for me. Usually if I hit the 60% mark and I don't see myself continuing, I will stop. As I said, I didn't actually mind the first book. I did enjoy it, which is weird for me because I don't usually like dark romances. But because I enjoyed the first book, I thought I'd also enjoy this book. Granted, it has been a while since I read the first book, probably like a year in between, so maybe that's my fault, maybe my taste has changed, but it really didn't feel like it was part of the same like duet, if that makes sense. It felt very different. It felt like I was reading a completely different book. I remember reading in the first book about a serial killer, and I remember reading about him, and it was just like, this was not the same person. It's like there was just a complete character transplant or personality transplant, and I understand he's in love, but surely he'll still retain some of those key characteristics that make him a psycho, but he didn't. So yeah, that was really confusing for me, and I didn't really like it, if I'm gonna be honest. I couldn't get into it as much as I wanted to, because I thought, finally, there's a dark romance out there that I like, but alas, it's not the case. So those are some autumnal books, autumnal reads. I do plan on making another one for winter because I love winter as well, and I love reading in the winter. And I will have a lot of books for that video, and the books will be better. No offense to some of these books or to the authors, but I've been reading some great reads, some great books lately, and I would love to speak about them. So